Conservative political prognosticators Elijah Schaefer and Sarah Stock do their best to try to prove the red pill right by having an affair while they were married. But is marriage still good or not for men? Let's get into it. Before we go too far, my name is Casey and I have been a husband, father, and yes, even a couples counselor for more than a decade, and I have seen the rise of women leaving marriages, oftentimes to seek a scarcity mindset or to pursue other relationships, and I'm here today to try to defend marriage in a world that seems to be pushing it all the way out into the margins. If you can get behind that, please like, share, and subscribe on the way in. Let's see, is marriage still good for men? And did Elijah Schaefer and Sarah Stock, these two potential grifters in the conservative movement, prove the red pill right?
Alleged with a substantial amount of evidence that Sarah was in fact sleeping with her boss, Elijah Schaefer, who runs a small conservative media company called Rift TV, up to the moment that she became engaged to another man named Will. So in other words, the allegation is that Sarah was cheating on her boyfriend and future fiance with her boss, who was a married man at the time.
For those of you who may not be on X, God bless you for one thing, and secondly, you might have missed the fact that Sarah Stock, who has been one of these trad wife influencers who recently converted to Catholicism and was blessed by the Pope with her new husband, was divulged by Milo Yiannopoulos to have had an affair with a married man and her boss named Elijah Schaefer, who runs a small political commentary channel on YouTube. I think it's called The Rift. So anyway, I don't really tune into either one of these people, and I don't really think that a true trad wife is somebody who's taking pictures and getting in debates on the internet about trad wifery, because they're probably at home or don't have time for that or are busy cooking sourdough or taking care of children. But Sarah Stock was recently married to someone who now seems to have been sort of tricked into thinking that she was chaste in her way into the marriage, if you know what I mean. And so while the conservative movement attempts to bring forth these ideas of chastity or of a mindset of conservatism, the truth is that media will oftentimes attract people who have cluster B personality traits, which are like narcissism and other things like that, that could easily, even if they're not a true narcissist, they could easily point more in that direction for somebody who wants to get in front of the camera all day, every day, or become a social media creator. And so it's very possible that these two are just playing into some of their psychological difficulties while they entered into this affair. And we know, as people who all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, we know that when you begin to sin, that season becomes one that continues to make justifications that push us further and further into a sin struggle and in making more and more bad decisions, and perhaps even escalating those decisions because we tolerate sin almost like it's a drug, in that when we do a particular amount or level, frequency, intensity, or duration of sin, when that eventually wears off, it's not satisfactory to go back to that same intensity, frequency, and duration. And so we escalate and escalate so that it becomes more exciting. Now, I'm not giving Sarah and Elijah a pass. However, we all know that once you fall into that season, it can be very difficult not to escalate the behavior to try to get a greater and greater reward. And so this seems to be where these two have ended up.
Instead, she posted the following message to her account on X. It says, quote, "A lot of what has been said about me is completely untrue. That being said, there are mistakes, unwise decisions I've made that I deeply regret. I have sinned. I apologize to everyone who has been scandalized by this. Please pray. Logging off now."
Seems like in a world that seems like there's a lot of scarcity of resources, where it seems as if while the economy continues to get worse and the currency is inflated, that women oftentimes are seeking more and more resource amalgamation or resource gathering in order to be able to provide for themselves in the long run. And as they enter into the workforce and rely less upon men and marriage and husbandry in their lives, they may actually seek more and more resources. And so 70% of divorces are initiated by women. That has been true for a nearly static since even the 40s and 50s, when we thought of marriage as a much more traditional and well utilized institution. But even at that time, while divorces may have been more infrequent, it was still most oftentimes pursued by the woman. So in this case, this gentleman, Sarah Stock's husband, who most recently, they just very recently got married, might actually be pursuing an annulment. And so in this case, it actually would be him who's seeking the dissolution of the marriage. But that doesn't get to the point. Is marriage still good for men? It's been good for me, and I can tell you some of the personal reasons why, but I think from the psychological standpoint, you'll be more interested in what the statistics say. Let's get into that.
That women give for divorcing their husbands include that they feel they aren't getting enough attention, their husband is holding back their career, that they, quote, grew apart. In other words, the woman got bored. And like Sarah Stock, apparently, they wanted to try something new. And they convinced themselves that there's nothing wrong with, giving another man a try. And there's nothing stopping these women from walking into a courtroom, telling the judge they're bored, and taking 50% of their husband's assets, along with alimony. Even in conservative states, they can get away with that.
Aside from the biblical standpoint, there is a reason why monogamy and marriage work for men. So let's take the psychological and emotional benefits first. Of course, there are lower rates of depression. There are lower, reduced amounts of loneliness and social isolation. There's greater emotional stability over time, which you can imagine is very natural for men who have those that they need to provide for and protect. Our emotional stability is higher because we have more people relying upon us, and that's just sort of adaptive and instinctive in us. We have higher overall rates of reported life satisfaction according to the General Social Survey, men who are married. We have a stronger sense of identity and purpose because we are building legacy, and we actually want to leave an imprint on a world in which our children will have to wrestle with later in life. We have more consistent emotional support. And while marriage as an institution means less and less, it seems like, to newer generations, less people seeking marriage, less people think the institution has value. It is still true that when you come home to a wife who in general is trying to support you, and the same is true in reverse, it is more emotionally rigorous and more emotionally supportive than what you would have if you were living a single life and just trying to spread your seed in that way.
What you can get, what billions of men have gotten, are children you love and who love you, who carry on your legacy, your bloodline, and your family name. You can have a family that is stable and whole, one that gives you a sure sense of purpose every single day of your life, a family you live with and share your life with and serve and lead and raise. Okay, so you can get love, meaning, purpose, and legacy. That's what you can get. It's not an emotional argument because those are not emotions. Those are real things. Those are nothing less than the greatest things life has to offer.
Men who are married also have some physical health values. And I would say, from a person in recovery, this one is very true. Men who are married participate in substance abuse and misuse at a less frequent rate. They live longer on average. They have less heart disease. They recover more quickly from illnesses. They have stronger immune function, and they have reduced engagement in high-risk behaviors. Of course, as people are reliant upon us, we do not participate in jumping off of things or driving too fast as often. For men who are married, they have a more structured daily life. They have increased long-term planning. They have reduced reckless decision-making. They have greater impulse control and less involvement in crime. And again, as someone is dependent on us, even if children aren't involved in the picture, a great many of these behavioral risks do ring differently, because if I wanted to quit my job, for instance, which is kind of a high-risk behavior, I have someone else to consider. It's a great learning process for men to begin to consider someone else as more important than themselves. And as Jordan Peterson says, that is when we become the highest form of who we can possibly be, when we put someone else above ourselves. Just as Christ did with his church, he went to his demise in order to provide for her. And so too, we as men, and Christian men especially, try to formulate our ideas of our own behavior based on how this affects someone else. It is of key importance, and it's part of the reason why men who are married have better behavioral outcomes. As I've covered previously on this channel, in Brad Wilcox's book, Get Married, he states that men who have marriages have higher lifetime earnings overall, which I believe that in his citation of the GSS, it's about 11% more earnings on average for men who are married, even if there are not children involved. Now, the argument against that from like the red pill bros would be, well, you could lose half of that when and if you get divorced. And yes, that's completely true. And I would not minimize the fact that there are greater risks for men seeking and sustaining marriage now. Of course, I have been highly blessed by my wife, and not to throw shade at these conservative influencers who got in this trouble most recently, but your selection biases for marriage. Of course, I'm just a mid-looking, Midwestern, middle-aged man, so I didn't have prospects that were as high as in beauty and in earnings and stability as my wife has. All of those in spades. I shouldn't have had the opportunity to be with her, and so as I consider her sort of at least a little bit out of my league, that has galvanized me to try to seek to be better and to try to increase my station, whether it's in my job prospects, in my physical health. I try to work out. It doesn't always work out, but all of those things I attempt to be better because I consider her to be of high status, even though she's, coming from just a traditional American family. So those things have galvanized me, and my earning potential, of course, is something I continue to strive to increase, not just because we continue to have more children, but because she deserves it. She deserves the stability, and it is my role as a man and as a husband to try to provide that. That type of mindset and mentality has obviously increased my capacity. It caused me to go back to school twice since we've been married, and it has caused me to continue to seek leadership in all of the institutions that I work for, and to continue to try to build something that's meaningful and sustainable, even here on YouTube or elsewhere in my life. And that does not even speak to the role that I have gained as being a father of four, and that ultimately has even been a greater galvanizer, which would be a very typical outcome for many men who get married.
I consider the fact that as of the most recent data, roughly 70% of divorces are initiated by women. That's according to research from the American Sociological Association, but plenty of other sources agree on that point. In fact, the number rises to between 80 and 90% when you only look at highly educated women.
For men who are married, there are social outcomes that are increased in and can increase the well-being of a man in comparison to those who do not get married. You have a larger and more stable social network. So women are obviously better at networking than us, as well as having connection to extended family. My in-laws have been extremely supportive, and we still go over there once a week and take all of our children over there once weekly in order to have a family meal. There's greater community involvement, again, as women are better networkers than us, and there's increased likelihood of being cared for in a crisis. Of course, if we get sick as men, and we can be maybe perhaps a little bit dramatic about that, the amount of support that we receive. I remember getting sick when I was single. I went through a long period of singleness before I started dating again after I got sober, and during that time, when I would get sick, it was just me, and it was like a bottle of whatever medicine, Dayquil or whatever, and me in the couch, and it was I would not take care of myself, just being real. And that has obviously starkly changed. And I'd get sick much less now that I'm married, even though we have a lot of snotty kids in our house all the time. Of course, the meaning and directional purpose within marriage is one of the greatest things that can come out of it, which is I set my targets very high. I know what my meaning is. I know what my purpose is. I know that I have a legacy to build, and that my children ultimately will carry that throughout the generations. Long after my name is forgotten, the way that I have treated them and the words that I speak to them and what I teach them will be carried through the generations. And if I have any perpetual or long-lasting legacy, long after my money is gone, that will be it. How did I treat, teach, and speak to my children? That will last well beyond anyone who remembers my name. So this is setting your target at the highest ideal, and even if we don't reach it in completion, we will have growth and strengthening along the way, and that is available within marriage. I would also say, just as a side note, there are some intimacy benefits to being married in contrast to having a single life where intimacy is involved. And while I've lived them both, I can speak to experientially that intimacy within marriage is better. You just simply learn the individual that you are intimate with in ways that you do not have the opportunity to do unless you're in a long-term relationship with someone else, in which case you might be monogamous and potentially married anyway. And so those benefits, just as a side note, come along with it. Listen, there are drawbacks. There is the potential that you could lose your bag, that you could go and get married to the wrong person and end up losing your fortune or losing access to your children. And I would be remiss if I didn't counsel men against it at times because of lack of clear decision making or the red flags that we tend to blow past when we're excited about a new relationship. So there are reasons why Andrew Tate has an audience. There are reasons why the Red Pill Bros and the Manosphere has an audience, because there are a great many men who have been manipulated. Similarly, there are a great many women that have been manipulated to jump into relationships, but marriage and children seem to be something that men are more compelled to in younger generations than women are now. And so in that way, we should be exceedingly careful. And I have counseled men who were not careful or who were suffering the consequences of being secondary, of not being an authority within their marriage and their relationships. In conclusion, the takeaway is not that any marriage is better than not being married. Of course, we must be discerning. Of course, men have a lot to lose. And of course, it seems like we've even been manipulated over the course of the last decade or so, as feminism has come to bear on so many of the decision makings surrounding relationships in public. Men must be careful. However, the statistics and the biblical precedent bear out that marriage is good for men, it's good for women, it's good for the raising of children, and most importantly, if you plan on having kids, children benefit so much more greatly, not only that their father would be in the home, but that their father would be married to their mother. Usually, typically, the opposite gendered child, so my daughters, it would be my son for my wife, take a great many of their relationship cues and what they expect in their future relationships from the ways that you treat them. And so if they are not experiencing that firsthand in ways that are good and consistent, then they will have worse outcomes later in life. And so marriage is really the exercise of putting someone else above yourself. And if we learn to do that as men, we have less risk taking, we make more money, we're better cared for, and we can do good and even great things. But we must be careful, we must take heed, we must be discerning, because there are those who would manipulate that desire, that good desire in us, and try to use it against us. So in general, Sarah Stock and Elijah Schaefer proved that conservative podcasters, for one, are not always who they say they are. Secondarily, the men and women that were jumping into relationships might not always be who they say they are. And thirdly, you need to be very careful and discerning as a man before you jump into a marriage with a woman. But it is still good for us. It is still glorifying to God, and it is still better for your children. If you would like to build a future of faith, fatherhood, and yes, even marriage, please like, share, and subscribe. I would love to earn your support. Thanks for watching to the end.